things said about me, and I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to thank everybody.
From baseball legend to heartbreaking decline, did Babe Ruth's dream of managing contribute to his tragic end? Let us learn more about one of the oldest baseball legends, George Herman Ruth. Well, on February 6, 1895, something big went down. Here was a little fellow who was to become the great George Herman Ruth Jr., who came into the world not in some fancy hospital, if you please, but right there in his grandfather's house. See, his parents, Katherine and George Sr., were German immigrants working their tails off. Lightning rod salesman, streetcar operator, you name it. It was a hard life, and most of young George's siblings didn't make it through to babyhood. Just him and his sister Mamie hung around. Now here's where things get hazy, like chowder on a foggy morning. We don't really know why, but when George was only 7, he ended up at St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys. Now that wasn't much like Harvard, you hear? More like a straightening house keeping young fellas somewhat too rambunctious straight, you feel me? Well, George, bless his heart, was a tough cookie. He didn't let the bullies break him. Instead, he took that frustration, anger, and channeled it into something powerful. His game of baseball. Still, St. Mary's had an ace up its sleeve. Brother Matthias. That burly, strapping man wasn't into discipline alone. He saw something special in George. Now, George really wasn't your typical baseball player. Lefty, check, catcher? Not so much, especially for a southpaw. But Brother Matthias, bless his soul, made it work. He became a mentor, a father figure to George, teaching him the game, maybe even a little something about life. But before we dig up George's life any further, make sure to like and subscribe. Ah yes, and now, back to the video. Life there wasn't easy for George. Other kids, some bigger and meaner, saw him as an outsider. They probably poked fun at his clothes, his accent, maybe even the way he swung that baseball bat. Let's face it, being a lefty in a world of righties can feel like wearing 2 left shoes, you know? They called him names, hurtful ones that stung worse than a beanball to the head. Yet little George was a sturdy cookie, and he learned to play baseball. George was a natural. He played like a man possessed, tearing it up at St. Mary's leagues. Pitching, hitting bombs out of the park, you name it, he could do it. By the time he turned 18, scouts were taking notice, seeing the raw talent just waiting to explode. 1914, Boston. The Red Sox picked up this young Ruth, who had a gun for an arm, but had all the nerves most kids just coming right out of the minors would. He struggled at first, sure, then bam, he nails his first win and throws the heat like nobody's business. You could see something special in him, a glint of pure, plain baseball magic. Well, the next few years were something else. Ruth spent some time down in the minors, smoothing out the rough edges, sharpening that curve like a butcher's knife. Next thing you know, there he is again, right in Boston, the full-bore ace. He led the Red Sox to World Series championship victories clear through 15 and 16. Now there's your champion. But get a load of this then. This Babe Ruth, he wasn't just some flamethrower. The man could smack a baseball. I mean, we're talking moonshots that would clear the bleachers and make you wonder where in tarnation the ball even went. It was like this giant had some sort of secret weapon for an arm, launching those bombs further than anybody ever seen. Now Ruth, he had this itch to play outfield more, a hankering really to let loose with that bat. Then the war happened. It put everything on hold, so to speak. Can't play ball in a thin roster, especially more depths like baseball was. So with things really about to take off on a dramatic turn, the Sox decided it would be smart for his career to shift Ruth full-time into the outfield. And boy, can I tell you, shades were about to open on their legendary career. Home runs? Forget about it. Ruth started smashing dingers left, right, and center. Records were shattered like glass figurines. This kid was a sensation, drawing crowds bigger than a St. Patrick's Day parade. But here's the shocker, the part that still has folks around here scratching their heads. The Red Sox, they go and sell Ruth to the darn New York Yankees. A trade that still makes some folks see red, that's for sure. The 1924 Yankees weren't really in the best position. Meanwhile, Babe Ruth was having the time of his life, slugging the ball pretty much like it owed him some rent, leading the league with a mammoth 46 home runs and bagging his first ever batting championship title. Moving right along, Ruth never exactly looked your typical athlete, kind of like toothpicks holding up a piano. That's Babe. He had large shoulders but legs as thin as twigs. Well, in 1923 and 1924, Ruth had been attempting to get in shape. Let's say the burgers and beers took early in the year 1925. He went down to Hot Springs, Arkansas. It was all for a little training, rightly. Well, the whooping it up far outweighed the working out. By the time he left, he wasn't feeling too good. Be provocatively nasty. Things only got worse during spring training and right on into Asheville, North Carolina. Babe straight up collapsed. The news traveled with gossipy speed. There were rumors galore. Some even thought that he died. And things only got wilder back in New York. Poor Babe keeled over again, found unconscious in his New York hotel bathroom. At the hospital, he convulsed horribly. The poor fellow. Sports writers had a field day with this whole mess. One even cracked a joke that it was just a pre-game hot dog and soda binge by Babe. That is, the bellyache heard round the world. Funny, huh? Except no one knew for sure just what made Babe so sick. It's a mystery to this day. In 1929, Yankee pinstripes finally made an appearance. Not for slimming Babe Ruth, but simply as a fashion statement. Despite Ruth's home runs, athletic teams never stopped winning. Tragedy occurred when manager Huggins died. Ruth lobbied to take over as player manager. The Yankees said no. After some salary battles, Ruth continued to hit bombs and even managed to win a World Series via a legendary called shot homer. Years went by, as did the bruises, and the Ruth era began to fade. He wanted to be placed as manager of the Yankees, but they had other ideas in mind. Sold to the Boston Braves in what would prove to be his final season, Ruth felt cheated. Finally, he saw the light and retired in 1935 with the record 714 homers. A legend was, quite literally, carved into baseball lore forever. You think the story ends with Babe Ruth blasting homers and calling his shots. Even the Sultan of SWAT couldn't hit a forever ball into a managerial career. Sure, in 1935 he retired after a squabble with his Braves owner. But Ruth wasn't ready to hang up his spikes, metaphorically speaking, at least. He is still the baseball man, so much a leader on the field that becoming a manager seemed the natural next step. People were pretty straight-laced back then. Ruth, who loved a good time, well, he really wasn't considered very manager material. Team owners are afraid that if he can't even manage himself, how can he manage other players? You know? Kind of a harsh judgment when you consider some legendary managers weren't exactly choir boys themselves. So Ruth struck out on the manager dream. Even though he was practically baseball royalty, one of the first 5 guys inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1936, he did land a gig as a first base coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1938. More of a ceremonial role, really show up in uniform and cheer on the runners. Not exactly the strategic mastermind role that was in his heart. He even offered to pinch hit. Never mind that, considering his eyesight and dodgy knees. All of this, along with some personality clashes with the new manager, caused Ruth to leave the coaching gig altogether. Baseball, however, wasn't through with Ruth just yet. He used his celebrity to promote the war effort in World War II. He appeared in an exhibition game at Yankee Stadium in which he slugged a long fly ball. But that manager dream, it never came to be. Some folks even said it led to a rough patch in his later years. Bet that talent, all that knowledge of baseball, just unused. So Ruth kept swinging for the fences even after he retired, you know? As far back as 46, long after hanging up his cleats, it was maybe this new Yankees boss, that MacPhail guy, would see him a little different. This time, maybe they would give him that manager job he always wanted. Nope, another strikeout, a rejection letter. Bummer, right? His family even said later that all this no thanks stuff, especially from his own Yankees, really got to him. They think it might have even pushed him into a bit of depression. Yikes, that's a tough way to end such a glorious career. Things weren't all roses and riding off into the sunset for the Babe during his later years. Since the war, doctors had been warning him to take care of himself, and he had just canceled plans to visit the South Pacific to raise morale. By 1946, those days were over. Ruth started having some serious aches in the region of his eye and began to have trouble swallowing. The tests at the hospital gave bad news, an inoperable tumor at the base of his skull and neck. Nasty stuff called nasopharyngeal carcinoma. Some folks even believe that it might have been worsened by part of his lifelong love affair with tobacco. Though he was a celebrity, treatments at that time sort of were grueling. Ruth was the first person to undergo a combination of drugs and radiation all together. He lost a ton of weight, but eventually made it out of the hospital and even went down to Florida to recover. With new chemo treatments, there was a glimmer of hope. Doctors did not tell Ruth about his diagnosis with cancer for fear that he might hurt himself. A great many things were tried, and for some time it all seemed to work as the doctors had hoped. Ruth even maintained a promotional tour and felt good enough one day to attend another day in his honor at Yankee Stadium. Sadly, it wasn't meant to last. By late 1947, Ruth was too weak to even help write his autobiography. He spent the next year in and out of the hospital, still managing to live life as best he could. For thousands of fans, many of them kids, Ruth's condition kept vigil outside the hospital. On August 16, 1948, at the age of 53, the Sultan of Swat sadly passed away in his sleep. His mortal life ended such that for days on, hundreds lined up to pay respect to his open casket placed inside Yankee Stadium.
Of his greatest conquests draws mourning tens of thousands for a final glimpse of America's best-known, best-loved sports figure, George Herman Babe Ruth.
That's it for this one. If you like this video, make sure to check out our video on other baseball icons.